Hey everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold here with our weekly lecture series. The dogs are really adamant that I start on time. This lecture is part 2 of our Vera Menchik series. Last week we did a lecture on Vera Menchik, the early years, which was the 1920s. And today's lecture will be on Vera Menchik's games from the later part of her career, which was the 30s and the 40s. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, unfortunately, Vera Menchik died in World War II when they bombed her abode in London, along with I think her mom and her sister died also in the attack. I want to thank our sponsor, Shea Crippen. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture, you can contact Karen. Her information's on the screen now. If you're watching on YouTube, and we can sponsor a lecture on whatever topic you'd like. So last week I looked at the Wikipedia article until about 1930, and then I figured that was like halfway through her career. And then in the 30s, she beat Max Erva twice. She had 2 title defenses of her world championship. The Women's World Championship in the 30s wasn't like the World Championships now, where it's like one person versus another. They would have round robin or double round robins with anywhere from 4 to 8 players, and she won all of her title defenses and all the World Championships she played in. And one thing I wanted to discuss this lecture, which I didn't discuss much last lecture, was the absolute dominance that Vera Menchik had over the rest of the world, the rest of the female world. And the only thing I can compare it to is Morphy in chess. I was thinking in tennis, Serena Williams at her absolute best was way better than everybody else. But in my opinion, the difference between Serena Williams and the other female players was not as great as Vera Menchik and the other female chess players. I can only compare it to Morphy, Morphy was way better than everybody else in his time. And Vera Menchik was the same. And when I was a kid, I was, in a chess family. My brother plays chess. My dad played chess. And my dad was a master. And I knew all the old masters. My dad preferred Capablanca over everybody else. But he talked about, the old masters a lot. And the only woman we talked about was Vera Menchik. And there were other women who were strong. But she was way better than everybody else. So typically, in the Women's World Championship double round robins, she would win all of her games, go 14-0 and 8-0 and 10-0, and she just was way better than everybody else. And one of the games that we're going to look at is a silly game because it shows you how much stronger Vera Menchik was than her peers. This was in a World Championship, and her opponent played like she was about 1,200, I would say, or maybe worse. Because basically, women didn't play chess in the 20s and 30s, and the ones who did weren't very strong because it was less than 1% of tournament players were women. Now it's probably closer to 10-15%, if I had to guess. Of course, if you're watching on YouTube, you're going to put in the chat, it's not 10 to 15%, it's this, you moron. But when I go to tournaments, I see plenty of women, and I see plenty of females who are young, and I see them winning sections and becoming masters and international masters and grandmasters. And it just wasn't like that in the 20s, 30s, and 40s when Vera Menchik was playing. Vera Menchik was a world-class player. She was the Judah Polgar of her time. And probably that's similar, Vera Menchik dominating the way Judith would have dominated women's chess if she played women's chess. But maybe Vera Menchik dominated even more. Judith Polgar didn't play in women's tournaments. If she did, she would have been women's world champion several times. She would have won a lot of Olympiads. She would have won a lot of round robins that are just women pretty easily, actually. But that wasn't really her interest. And unlike the other women of the 20s and 30s, Vera Menchik played in mixed tournaments and tournaments with just men and her, and was very successful. And she was even more successful in women's events like the Olympiad, where she played other women, and the Women's World Championship, and so forth. But there's a lot of famous players that she played over the years, like Alekhine, Capablanca, Najdorf, Salo Floor, George Thomas, Sultan Khan, which it mentions here, who she beat. And other women of that era didn't play in men's tournaments because they either didn't want to or they weren't strong enough. But that wasn't a problem at all for Vera Menchik, because not only did she play the best players in the world, occasionally she would win and draw. So anyway, the Wikipedia talks about her career in the 30s and early 40s pretty in depth. There's even a picture of the hotel where she played the Women's World Championship match against Sonia Graf, 1937. Coincidentally, the year my dad was born. Looks like a nice hotel, especially for 37. They talk about tournaments she played in where she would play in men's tournaments and score, in the top half, and so forth. Talk about her playing style, and I want to put a caveat to that. She was a positional player, which I'm highlighting in blue now, and I definitely agree with that. However, sometimes when she played women who were not at her level, and she knew that, like she was way better than them, she wouldn't play positional sometimes. She would just run them over like a bus. So she knew how to play tactically, but she preferred to play strategically and positionally, unless she was just way better than her opponent, then she would just crush them. It says Menchik was undoubtedly the best female player before the Second World War, and she was more than that. She was way better than everybody else. She was women's world champion for almost 17 years, and she passed away in 1944 due to the bombing I was talking about earlier, and so forth. Menchik was the first and only woman accepted as a master in the period she was competing. I've heard of Sonia Graf, and she played in some strong open tournaments also, but just not at Menchik's level. Not a bad player. She worked with some strong grandmasters, people of grandmaster strength. But as Wikipedia points out, and I'll highlight that, Menchik's lifetime score against Graf is 15 wins, 3 losses, and 5 draws. I mean, that sounds like, just based on that, she was probably 300 points better than Graf. Yeah, and I remember when I was a kid, the joke was being a member of the Vera Menchik Club, and those were master players or better who had lost to Vera Menchik in a tournament. And so that your name would be added to the list of people, who lost. It says the inaugural GM members were Max Erva, Jacques Miases, Samuel Reshevsky, Frederick Samish, and so forth. She also played Salo Flor, Ernst Grunfeld, Andor Lilienthal, Geza Marazzi, Najdorf, Rubinstein, Tartakauer, and Vidmar. And she drew games against all of those players. So she was obviously strong master strength. And Wikipedia article is, I think, the right length for her. Sometimes articles are too short because they don't realize the greatness. But Vera Menchik's article talks about a lot of stuff. It shows a postage stamp that she was on in 2001 in Yugoslavia. Talks about her family, what she did outside of chess, what she was like as a person, what happened in World War II where she was killed. And then they have tournaments she played in and her results in those tournaments. Those tournaments typically were very strong tournaments with lots of masters and future grandmasters. Really wasn't, the grandmaster title didn't really exist in the 30s. So these are people who were grandmaster strength, but they just didn't have the title. Then this is very funny. This part of the Wikipedia article where it says Women's World Championship tournaments. And the reason it's funny is she came first place in all of them with scores like 14 out of 14, 9 out of 9, 8 out of 8, 10.5 out of 11, 18 out of 18, or does that say 18 out of 19? 18 out of 19, terrible. She had 2 draws. Okay. Then against Graf, they played a fun match, which she won 3-1. Then they played a world championship match where Menchik totally dominated and won 11.5, 4.5. And they show some bits of her games and such. So you can learn a lot about Vera Menchik and understand that she was, if she was male, she would have been one of the top male players in the world. And as a female, she was definitely the best female in the world. Okay, so first game we're going to look at, she has black, so I'll flip the board. This was played in Maribor, and the reason I'm showing this game is because I was in Maribor, and typically when I show great player of the past and show games they played in Europe, I wasn't necessarily in those cities, but I was in Maribor for the World Youth Championship. I was a coach. Let's see, what's her opponent's name? Josef Rajlu or something. I can't read the name because my vision's not so good. And my glasses are dirty, and there was a tornado, there was a flood, locusts. Okay, Menchik has black, and she plays Queen's Gambit Declined, which is what she played. She has a lot of games with black and the Queen's Gambit Declined. And she played the Taresh variation, which is very sharp. And after C takes D5, she played a very sharp gambit. So I think, as I said earlier, when Menchik was playing somebody she didn't feel was at her level, and wasn't a master player, she would play more tactically and more enterprisingly than if she was playing a master, then she would play more positionally. So she played the von Henning-Schara gambit, which is C takes D4. It's an interesting way to play with black. Some people still play it today. And basically white's a pawn ahead, and black gets to attack queen on D4 a lot as compensation. So knight C6 is the main move. Attacking the queen. Queen went to A4. White could also move the queen to the D file, keeping the defense of the D5 pawn. Black sacrifices a pawn. So queen A4 is already not the best move. Okay, takes, now material's equal. Knight F3. And queen b5, that's the move of a non-master. Attacks the bishop, but white's moving their queen too much, giving black the initiative. Queen d6 defends the bishop. Both sides develop their pieces. Bishop g5 doesn't look right. It seems like white should play bishop g2 and castle and get the king out of the center. Menchik plays aggressively, puts the knight in the center, threatens the f2 pawn. So trade on e4. Menchik got rid of her isolated pawn. Now Menchik is attacking the knight, and bishop b4 check is going to be annoying soon. Knight d2. She castles, sacrificing her e-pawn, which is pretty much poisoned. White can't get away with these kind of hijinks. White plays queen d4, queen a4, queen b5, and then gives a knight's tour. And white played g3 several moves ago, but forgot to follow it up with bishop g2 castles. So this is an example of Menchik playing a worse player and playing aggressively and punishing them very quickly. Bishop b4 check, king can't castle ever. Okay, and black is only a pawn down, but white's king is never going to get safe. Knight d4, double attack against the queen, and knight c2 check. Queen c4, bishop e6, attacking the queen, and the queen has to defend c2, as I noted earlier, and he played knight e4. Problem with white's position is, if white plays sort of an obvious move, like queen c3 or queen c1, which defends knight c2, then black plays rook c8, and white's just losing. So white played for tricks, knight e4, let's trade queens. Menchik played queen b6, doesn't want to trade queens, because white's king is in a lot of trouble. Again, the queen's attacked. So, queen d3, rook to c8, threatening knight c2 check, winning the rook as before. Knight c3, queen takes b2, threatening the knight on c3 and the rook on a1. And if two grandmasters were playing today, then white would resign, because white's going to lose a piece here. Also, I forgot to point out, I pointed out these two threats. I forgot to point out knight c2 check is also a threat. And it's a very strange game where white plays g3 in the opening and then never plays bishop g2 and castles. Then white started doing other stuff. That's why Menchik played aggressively, because her opponent wasn't at her level. Rook b1, Menchik wins a piece, and her opponent resigns. So a crushing victory for Menchik from playing a sharp Taresh von Henning-Schara gambit, and her opponent basically couldn't handle the truth. And I think 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when Menchik was playing, and then before her, 50 years before Morphy, people didn't have ratings. They didn't have official ratings, and they didn't have titles. So when Morphy was playing, and Steinitz, and Pillsbury, and Menchik, and Capablanca, some of the games were mismatches, where you're like, why is Menchik playing somebody so bad? And the reason is, there weren't 50 grandmasters in your city like there are now. You didn't know everybody's rating live on chess sites and on US Chess and FIDE. They didn't have any of that. So a lot of times people would think they're good at chess and play in chess tournaments, then they would find out that they're not very good. And the people who are good are the people you've heard of. If you've heard of somebody who played 1930s, 1920s, 1910s, that's because they were really good, like Rubinstein, Nimzowitsch, Taresh, Tartakower, Najdorf, Menchik. And a lot of times I show a game and you're like, well, who's Menchik's opponent? And the answer is exactly. And that's why, you separate masters from non-masters by seeing who has a good score overall over a long period of time. Okay. Okay, next game, Vera Menchik is white against Eero Book. So let me flip the board again. Okay, this guy's name is Book, so you know he's going to play a lot of Book moves. I've actually heard of Book. This game was played in 1938. This is she didn't play a lot of chess in the 40s because of the war, so this was one of her last few tournaments. Menchik's white. She plays positionally. And Vera Menchik could also have black in this position because she plays the Queen's Gambit. C takes d5 is unusual. Normally, they take with the e-pawn. And this game actually reminds me of a game that I played this weekend in Charlotte, where we had the same pawn structure. So it's an exchange Slav where black's playing sort of passively. And my opponent played a6 and I played a4. Similar structure, except I had Finegold my bishop. That was a difference. So Menchik doesn't want her queen on c2 because you don't want your queen on the open c file because black's going to put a rook there. So she makes a battery this way, and she leaves the c1 square for her rook. So both sides are just maneuvering their pieces. Black's pretty equal here, not too many problems. But this game has a brilliant move later, so Menchik didn't get any advantage out of the opening. I mean, her opponent's name is Book. How are you supposed to get an advantage out of the opening? Okay, so pretty equal position. F5 was played, stopping white from getting another battery on this diagonal. Attacks the weak A pawn. Just move it around. And then in this position, knight h2 was played, and e4. And she played knight h2 to play e4. And that's not a move that most people would think of. But the idea is the queen and the king are lined up on the diagonal. So if black ever takes with the d pawn, I'm going to play queen takes e6 check and take the bishop on d6. And Menchik didn't want, after e4 and somebody takes, to have her pieces forked. So when she moved her knight out of the way, typically I would think white wants to play g4 because the knight on h2 defends g4, but better is e4. Busting open the center. Takes, she just takes back. Now if you take, then queen takes pawn check and takes the bishop. So he played queen c7. Now black has a weak center, e-pawn's weak, and we've opened up this diagonal. So he plays e5, busting open the center. And this is funny, she allows the fork because you just take it because of this pin. So he plays e takes d4, bishop f5. She can win the d pawn whenever she wants to. Not in a big hurry. Now, black has an isolated pawn. Bishop on b7 is not very good. Okay, then it got super tactical. So in this position, black's not threatening knight c3 because the pawn's on b2. And Menchik says, why don't you play knight c3? And there's a psychology in chess that most people don't understand. So b3 is either a terrible blunder or white is egging you on to play knight c3 because it's good for white. And, if you have black, you should be like, why did my opponent do that? How are they tricking me? But most people don't. They're just like, knight c3, oh boy, what a potzer my opponent is. Okay, so it just shows you that Menchik's a positional player, but when the tactics flow, she's very adept at that also. So she plays queen c2, and that threatens the knight, and it threatens white to have an attack on the black king. So you gotta save your knight, take a rook, check. Now, if you play king f8, knight g6 check, there's no way out of check with the king, so you have to give your queen away. So black played king h8, Menchik played knight g6 check, and then knight e5 is discovered check. And temporarily, black's material situation is fine because after king g8, black checks and defends the knight on d1, then black takes. And if we just stop here, black has a rook and two bishops for a queen. However, Menchik saw further than her opponent. She played queen d2, and black is going to lose one of the pieces on the back row. If black plays rook f1, then we can play queen e2, and we're not only threatening both of these pieces, we're threatening queen e6 check, winning the bishop on d6 with check. If I'm not mistaken, and I'm not, I think you also win this bishop, because we're going to check, take with check, then we're going to check somewhere, and all of black's pieces are hanging. So black played rook e4, and now white has a queen and a knight for rook and two bishops. Queen and knight is better. And she tactically tricked him later. Knight takes h6, a brilliant move, obviously overlooked by black. And takes. Now, when I originally looked at the game, I was thinking, well, white's going to take this next move, skewering the bishops, but black can just play rook e7. And then I was like, why is this good for white? Then I realized white's not going to play queen takes b6. White's going to check next move and take this bishop. It doesn't matter where the king goes. The king has 4 squares to go to, and whichever one you go to, I'm going to check you on the 7th rank and then take your bishop. So this check wins the bishop, and then this check wins the bishop on b7. And if you go to e7 or f7, then I can play queen h7 check and take your bishop. Then everything's hanging. So you're down material, and you're losing more material after you lose that material. So knight takes h6 was a brilliant tactic, and after queen takes h6, Book resigned. So Book lived up to his name. When the position was Book, he played really well. Then when they were out of Book, then she outplayed him positionally and then tactically. And Book was definitely master strength, but he just got outplayed this game. Okay, this game was played in the World Women's Championship in 1939, I believe. Although I can't see what it says, but I think that's what it says. Might be 38. And Vera Menchik was black, and this is the game I was thinking of to show how much better Vera Menchik was than other people of her time. Okay, so her opponent played like a collie, unusual move order. Then they played a very funny, like do-si-do, bishop g4. Normally white would play f3 or move the knight in the middle, but her opponent went back. And then Menchik didn't want to trade pieces, so she went back. So unusual opening. Black is already at least equal. Okay, so I mean, no reason why white would be better here. Symmetrical pawn structure, and white's bishop on c1 isn't very good. Okay, c3, queen e7. So queen e7 is showing aggression because what black could do is play h6 and be safe so the bishop can escape, or black could castle and be safe. But queen e7 shows that Menchik wants to do more. She's thinking of castling queenside, and she's thinking of playing e5. Knight b3, that's a very poor move. And if I was playing this game over on the internet, or I was watching it in a tournament, I would realize that black is a much better player, because no master would play knight b3. The knight's not good on b3. And what white needs to do is get this bishop out. So most masters would play b3, bishop b2, c4, knight e5. No master would play b3, knight b3. Okay, knight e4, very aggressive in the center. Bishop d3, white likes moving her bishop. Black long castled, playing for the initiative on the king side. c4, threatening c5. c6, now the bishop has an escape squares in case c5 happens. C takes d5 also isn't a good move for white. White should be pushing her queenside pawns. Yeah, and you can see that doesn't make any sense. Knight a5, then back to b3. Black goes for the initiative on the king side. White moves her bishop again. Put it in h. h3 is a weakening move. And white doesn't really want to take the bishop, because then when black takes, black has the open h file, and black's going to have a mating attack. So Menchik just ignored that. Played queen d6, winding up the queen and bishop to the h2 square, taking on g4 sort of suicidal. Knight e5, very tactical. Bishop takes, attacking the queen. f6. If I was playing a blitz game, I'd probably take this pawn, but I never play f6. This was in the late 1930s. They didn't know about never play f6. And if the knight moves away, then they have queen h2 mate. So basically, you can tell by looking at this game and playing it over that black is a much more skilled player. And typically, when Menchik played people that weren't in her league, she would play more aggressively than if she was playing Capablanca or Alekhine or Spielman or Nimzovich and other strong players that she played. Okay, so white played knight f3. That prevents queen h2 mate because the knight is defending h2. g5, black wants to play g4. g3, blocking the queen and bishop, trying to prevent any disaster from happening. g4, black is crashing through. White has no counterplay. And you may have noticed that we're pretty late in the game, and white never moved her bishop on c1. Knight h4. Menchik plays sort of obvious sacrifice. Knight takes g3. Queen takes g3. And now white resigned. White has 3 legal moves. Knight g2 gets mated. Queen check. And bishop g3 mate. That's probably what white was banking on, because otherwise you're going to lose your knight on h4. Whether you play queen g2 or king h1. And now black has 2 pawns up, and black has a mating attack. So that's not good for white. And king h1 is probably worse. I could take this with check first, because my bishop is controlling h2, so you can't block with your queen. black's 3 pawns up and has a mating attack here also. So after queen takes g3 check, white resigned. And again, Menchik was way better than the other women, and that's why when there was women's world championships, she would usually get a perfect score. Although once she had 17 wins and 2 draws. What a failure. Terrible. Okay, and the funniest game I'm going to show you, then I'm going to show you the most serious game. This is the funniest game. This was also played in the Women's World Championship. Same one. And, I mean, I would estimate white's strength to be between 1,000 and 1,300. And somehow she's playing in the Women's World Championship because there just weren't a lot of strong women in the 1930s. And the main cause of that was women typically didn't play in chess tournaments. That was very unusual. So now it's not unusual, it's very common, and a lot of the women win their sections and are higher rated players and famous players. But in 1930s, there was Vera Menchik, and then there was everybody else. Okay, so white played the London, showing you how desperate the women were for playing the openings. Playing the London, no. Okay, and black has a lot of solid ways to play against the London, but Vera Menchik chose the most aggressive way because she knew that her opponent wasn't very good. So she played c5, which is the most aggressive move, and then she played queen b6, which is also the most aggressive move, putting pressure on b2. And you could see this position today in Grandmaster play. This is still theory. And white played bishop d3, which is not theory. That's not a move. Typically, white moves the knight out here, and then if the queen takes, knight b5, it's considered good for white. So bishop d3, I just play c4, attacking the bishop, then queen takes b2, and this is unfathomable what white did in this position. If I'm white in this position, then I'm playing knight bd2 because that defends my rook. Yeah, that's the only move I'm considering. But white castled, giving her rook away in the corner. That doesn't make any sense. And this is a world championship. Then white traded queens, which doesn't make any sense, down a rook. Nothing's happening, black's just up a rook. Then rook b1 doesn't make any sense. Black wants to play knight takes c3, although it doesn't matter. White could resign. Then knight takes c3, attacks the rook and the bishop, and white resigned. So that game reminded me of like when Morphy was playing somebody not in his league, which was everybody, and he would win very easily, and he would give people rook odds and knight odds and, play these gambits because he was just way better than everybody else. And in the women's chess world, this is what happened with Vera Menchik. She was master strength, playing with Capablanca and Alekhine and having tough, complicated games and drawing and winning against world-class players quite often. And then sometimes she'd play in the Women's World Championship and her opponents weren't very good, and then she would just run through them. Okay, that was a silly game, but now I have a very serious game. This is against Miguel Najdorf, who was one of the top 20 players in the world for about 30 years. And I really like this game because of the last move. So you might say, this game is boring. Finegold's boring. I hate Finegold. That's fine, but you're going to like the last move of this game, and that's going to end the video. So that's like, you have leaving them wanting more. Always end on a high note, like George. Okay, so this is Najdorf is white against Vera Menchik. Queen's Gambit, as we discussed earlier. Black plays very solid. It's an orthodox variation, still played today. Vera Menchik accepts the isolated pawn, activates her knight. Good thing the isolated pawn's there, defends the knight. Black has the two bishops. She gets rid of her isolated pawn. If white plays a move like rook d1 to pin the pawn, then I can play queen a5, and my queen attacks the knight, and my pawn attacks this knight. So white can't do that. So white took on d4. Black has the two bishops. White has a little initiative because black's queen side hasn't been developed. Bishop f3, making it difficult for the bishop to move off of the b pawn. Queen f4, attacking the knight on g5. Knight d5. Now it's too tactical. Stop the game, it's too exciting. So the idea is, if we take the knight, white has queen takes h7 mate. So Vera Menchik took the knight on g5, check, king h8, queen b3, knight e4 with a discovered attack against the knight on e7, and also threatening knight d2, forking everything. So Najdorf played queen b4, defending the knight, attacking this knight, and making knight d2 not as aggressive. Knight c5, blocking the queen's defense of the knight. Very tactical game. Rook c1, they traded. Now you must think that black is a little worse because black's bishop on c8 is no good. Rook e8, but the pawn structure is the same. Both sides got their king safe. White tried to win a pawn. Obviously, if black plays rook a b8 to take this pawn, you're losing your a7 pawn. So she played the other rook. And you might think, wait a minute, white can move the queen back and keep an eye on this rook. However, when I take this pawn, I also keeping an eye on this rook. So that's what happened. And now white could play for a win by taking this rook. And now if queen takes f2 check, my queen on a8 is defending g2. So I think this is good for white. And if black takes this rook, queen takes pawn, then white's a pawn up. White has winning chances. Although, now that I've said that, no, black has an immediate draw here. Wow. I'm sure both players saw this. Black plays rook b7, and we're attacking the rook and the queen. So queen takes rook is forced. Then I take with check. Then I take on a2, and we agree to a draw. So Menchik had it all figured out. And Najdorf played super exciting move here. Instead of taking the rook on a8, which we just looked at, which leads to a draw, played rook f3. Now, black looks like she's lost. The queen's attacked, the f-pawn is attacked, and the rook is attacked. And this is the move of the lecture. And it's the last move of the game. So that's a pretty good move of the lecture. This game ended in a draw because after the next move, the players agreed to a draw. So if you're watching on YouTube, pause your video and try to find the move that black played that equalizes the game. Remember, your queen's attacked, your rook's attacked, and if you play queen d8, your f-pawn's attacked. Now that I'm looking at this, it looks like rook d8 is okay. I don't see why rook d8 is not okay. I think after rook d8, it's a draw also. But I really like Vera Menchik's move. She played the most complicated move ever. with all pieces hanging. Roar! Usually, when it's symmetrical pawn structure and the pieces are the same, a queen and 2 rooks, not all the pieces on the board are hanging. Menchik played rook to d2. Now that's how you finish a chess game. And then every piece on the board is attacked. Both rooks, both queens. So if white takes anything, black will take the counterpart. So if white takes the queen, black takes the queen. That's pretty drawn. If white takes either rook, doesn't matter which one, then I take this rook with check. And black's threatening queen takes rook and rook takes queen. So rook d2, even though it leaves all the pieces hanging, is just an instant draw. Because after rook takes queen, that's a dead draw. And after queen takes rook, that's an instant draw. And if white plays queen takes a8, then black's better, because I take this with check, then your a pawn's falling. So white has no way to get an advantage, and after rook d2, players agreed to a draw. Miguel Najdorf, at his peak, was one of the top 10 players in the world. So Menchik drawing him with black, and she's also drawn him with black, another game that I could have shown you, but I like this one better. Anyway, that was Vera Menchik, the later years. It's too bad she died so young in World War II, but she's one of the most famous female chess players of all time. She was ahead of her time. She was a great player. I want to thank Shea Crippen for sponsoring the Vera Menchik lectures. If you want to sponsor a lecture, contact Karen. Thanks to everybody for watching on YouTube. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment. And I'll see you guys next time with more weekly lectures. Bye, everybody.